Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tech Talks with Trey the Cray. This is sadly our fourth and final video in the serverless series. So if you like this series, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you have any other ideas for topics that you want to see videos on in the future, please let me know in the comments below. I would like to welcome our guest for today, Gareth McCumskey. Gareth, how are you doing?
Hi there, Shreya. Hey, you got it perfectly right that time. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Gareth is actually previously a customer success manager and now a developer advocate for Serverless Inc. Gareth, could you tell us a little bit about your journey and what brought you all the way here today?
So yeah, I've been in building stuff for the web for quite a while now, since about the early 2000s or so. Seems like a long time now. And back in 2016, I happened to be working at a place where we really needed to rebuild a bunch of stuff, and somebody whispered the word serverless to me. And that kind of got me head deep into looking into serverless and what it could do and what it meant. And yeah, I haven't come up for air since. Back in 2019, I ended up joining Serverless Inc., the creators of the Serverless Framework, as a customer success engineer. Moved on to being sort of managing on the customer success side as well, just helping users of the framework and the tools serverless makes. And now I'm moved into the developer advocacy role, just so that I can talk to people more about serverless and how awesome it is.
Awesome. And what does your life look like as a developer advocate, and how is that different from being a customer success manager?
Well, the biggest difference is that instead of most of my time being spent chatting to folks about potential problems they might be having with tools or helping design solutions for folks, I'm working a lot more on the content side of things. As you can see here, I'm chatting to you today. And also a lot more on the educational side. And that's one of the things that I found usually ends up is missing a lot in the serverless world. I mean, there is a lot of great stuff out there. But there's so much more that we can put out there to help folks, learn about serverless and figure out, what's the best way to do things? How do we build things using serverless? Why is everyone talking about it being so awesome? Just wanted to show folks that.
Well, I'm really excited to kind of dive a little bit more deeper into the whole serverless world and web development with it, especially because up until now, all of my previous guests have been Microsoft MVP. So we've talked a decent amount about Azure and how that works and what it's for, how you can use it. But serverless is a slightly different product to something like Azure or AWS. So I'm interested to know a little bit more about what that is, why it exists, and what purpose it serves to various types of engineers.
Sure. So interestingly, serverless started with the serverless framework, and serverless as an idea is kind of kick-started by the arrival of AWS Lambda. So AWS is kind of the beginning point of what we call serverless today. They released this really amazing service called Lambda, which allowed you to just take a little piece of code, stick it on the cloud, and it ran for you. You didn't need to worry about a big machine, CPU, operating systems, all the usual stuff that you'd have to get set up and monitor and manage and maintain over time and so on. And it was a pretty cool invention, but was kind of isolated. And this is where Austin Collins, the founder of the Serverless Framework, decided that this could be a really great way to build apps, full-blown applications, and started the first version of the Serverless Framework. And the Serverless Framework is really designed to be a tool for developers. So if you're looking to build an application, maybe you want to build an online store of some kind where folks are accessing your app on the browser, buying products, putting in their details for shipping, all that kind of stuff we're used to on the web. The serverless framework helps you actually build that stuff using serverless technologies. And it sounds like a bit of a tautologist thing. I'm talking about serverless and serverless technologies, but really what it means is that instead of relying on a machine that you need to worry about all the infrastructure and apps and software loaded onto it, all you worry about is your actual thing you're trying to build, and using the existing services available in the cloud, like AWS, for example, or even Azure, to make that stuff available to your customers. So one of the examples I usually give and I have in a lot of the getting started stuff that I've created is if you look at a traditional web application, what you often got is a bunch of users all accessing your application, and that creates HTTP requests that hit your load balancer, which then go to virtual machines in the if you're in the cloud. Stuff that you've got to manage. Those virtual machines will talk to a database and so on. Whereas the serverless framework lets you write code and say, I want this to be accessed by HTTP. And when you deploy, it uses a service like API Gateway, which is available in AWS. And that's all you need to know about it. There's no machine that you need to load up. There's nothing that you need to install on it. You just configure the serverless framework to create an HTTP event on your little piece of code that you wrote. And it kind of sets that all up for you. And everything kind of works. And all the stuff behind the scenes, load management, scaling, all that kind of stuff that you would normally have to handle yourself is managed for you by API Gateway, this service that receives stuff. And that's just one of the examples. I mean, serverless development has so many ways for you to take what you would normally have to build yourself in a machine and use services in the cloud to do that stuff for you. So
that's very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about like examples of how you've seen people work with serverless, and maybe even like what is the process of getting into serverless or maybe transferring your applications over there?
Yeah, that's often a tough one because a lot of folks find themselves. Maybe I can use my own history as a way to get into that because it kind of fits for a lot of folks. I was in a position at one point where I came into a development team, leading a dev team. And it became clear very quickly that the scale that the business wanted to reach was nowhere near what the existing solution could handle, unfortunately. And this happens. Organizations will start off very small because they're just getting bootstrapped, they're just getting going. They're not going to spend a huge amount of time, effort, and money on massive, complex solutions that can handle huge amounts of traffic. And that's natural. That's how things work. But when you get to the point where you do need to scale up or you need to start changing things, as I said, this is where I sort of heard the word serverless whispered to me. And at this point, I was dealing with a really large, complex application sitting on traditional infrastructure with a big machine, doing things the good old-fashioned way we've done for a decade now in the cloud. But what changed here was that after looking at serverless, I realized, and the team realized together, that we could change things to work a lot better for the organization. So ultimately what we did was we realized that we needed to prove that the serverless stuff would work for us. So ultimately what we did is we picked one feature of the existing application, something that wasn't super critical, something that if it happened to not work great, wasn't a big deal, that we could quickly fix anyway. And we essentially took that one small piece and transitioned it as a serverless part of the application. So that was kind of useful because now it meant that we could take something that was actually production necessary but not critical and allow us just to gauge how good the serverless stuff could work. And thankfully for us, it worked out really, really well. It was a very strong solution. Taking one small piece out actually lightened the load for the rest of the application as a whole and allowed us to experiment and figure things out. Then there's many ways you can do this. We took one small piece of an application. Other things you can look for is things like cron jobs is a very, very common option. A lot of the time, you need these regularly run scripts that do maintenance work or trigger some kind of event or action within your system that you're building. And they can be kind of tricky to fit into these sort of monolithic applications that we're traditionally building. But serverless is really great for just doing these cron jobs for you. That's a great way to get started. Just farm these cron jobs off to Lambda functions to begin with. And then it gives you an opportunity to experiment and play with them. And combining the strength of front-end work with this kind of modularization means that you can, essentially what we ended up doing was taking entire chunks of our massive monolithic application and breaking it up from the front-end side into separate pieces that we could use services inside AWS like CloudFront to redirect to. So if you were heading to one portion of the site, it was going to the serverless stuff. If you went to a different portion of the site, non-serverless stuff, and you can transition these things over time. So there's really great ways that you can break these things up.
And something that comes to mind right now, a large part of my audience is engineers that are either new to engineering or they're still students and they're still kind of learning. And it's great to see that there's so many tools out there that are meant to help you develop more efficiently or more effectively. But what would you say about like just there being way too many tools to learn and to have to get started with?
Yeah, this is interesting because this is, to me, this is a symptom of the fact that the industry as a whole in software engineering is not just complex for the sake of complexity, but there's a lot of attempt to solve the problem of a shortage of skills, essentially. The software engineering field has a massive shortage of skills and will continue to have a shortage, apparently, for the next few decades. And there's a lot of work going on to find ways to try and make do without all the talent you really need, which sounds kind of scary, but serverless is a kind of a response to that because you could have your development team, for example, spending a week or two, which I've had to do in the past, configuring a machine and a server and load balancers and auto scaling and all the things that you would traditionally do before you've even got an application you're making available to customers and generating revenue. Or you can use tools that help those developers focus on building the solution that actually generates revenue, and that the shortage of engineers is creating. So serverless is a response to that, and all the technology that we see around us in general as a way to speed developers up. Try to find ways to get the most out of the rare skills that you are able to get. And serverless focuses on this on the infrastructure hosting management side of things, where I can configure a simple YAML configuration file, run a command in my terminal, and it puts stuff into the cloud for me without me having to get involved, doing that in detail and wasting my time there, nor wasting my time maintaining that. And then everything else we have, the gazillion JavaScript frameworks we find, is essentially teams and developers out there scratching their own itches, solving their own problems, and hoping to put them out there for others to use them to solve. React was essentially a solution put out by Facebook because they had a unique problem dealing with putting JavaScript and HTML and CSS out there and managing it at a large scale. That was their solution to it. Angular was Google's potential solution to that. All of these things are developers scratching their own itches to speed themselves up because they're under such constraints. And that ends up creating a world where you have a lot of technologies to deal with.
And then for those engineers who are still trying to figure out whether it's the right technology for them to use and get started with, what is the process of learning and, becoming more comfortable enough that they can, use it professionally?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Really, the focus that I like to recommend is to focus on outcomes. So instead of saying, you could absolutely go to college or university and get yourself your BSc computer science degree. It's not going to hurt you. You are going to spend a fair amount of time not doing actual work that's going to gain you experience, but a degree can be useful. So I'm not going to debate that. But if you're looking just to get into tech, and you don't have to have a degree to get into tech, that's one of the amazing things about it. What's really useful is to find ways to solve practical problems. I find a lot of organizations find profiles really useful that have actual demonstrative solutions showing that you can do things, that you're able to build stuff. And again, in the serverless world, one thing that makes that easy is that it's actually very easy and very cheap to stick stuff out into the cloud in AWS or Azure or wherever. Put it out there for folks to look at and try out. But that's, to me, is the biggest one, is just to find practical ways. So this is also where you find the boot camps come up a lot. And a lot of the boot camps end up focusing on actual practical end results instead of miring you in theory and so on. Knowing some theory is a good thing. Understanding how networks and HTTP as a protocol works is good, but it's useless if you can't build something out of that. So that's where, having some practical engineering practice is the most important.
I agree. And I just want to link over here that there is going to be a blog in the description below that Gareth's written about how you can get started with serverless. And I know, Gareth, you do like this weekly live stream as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I said, teaching folks is something I really want to do because there's a real shortage of it. So every week, 10 a.m. Pacific on Tuesdays, we have a getting started webinar. So if folks are looking at getting into serverless, and this is a webinar that shows, it's only 30 minutes long, so it's pretty quick. But it ends up on YouTube, and you can go through it multiple times and then try things out yourself. It's a really simple way to get into building an actual functional REST API in AWS very, very quickly. And it's a really interesting way to just quickly learn and get started with serverless.
Love it. So moving forwards from just like getting started, now we have all of the resources that we need to successfully get started with serverless. What are your thoughts on best practices when it comes to coding with serverless?
Wow, there's a lot to go through there. But one of the things that I often try to get across to folks when I'm talking to them is the idea of simplicity. So when you're building your serverless solutions, if you're looking at any solution, actually, in any engineering thing you're building, simplicity is often the best way to build things. And if you're looking at AWS and how to build serverless stuff in AWS, AWS has an absolute ton of stuff that you can use. There's I can't even go through a list of it. It's way too long, and you could very easily start bringing all sorts of things in and build some of the most complex and most intricate and most beautiful looking things of complexity that you can imagine. And while that might be exciting as an engineer to build what looks like this really impressive, complicated, complex system that can do amazing things, it's usually not the right choice. So if you can get away with just having an HTTP endpoint, that's what you should do. But you should also know the limitations of that so that you could, expand that out if you absolutely had to. If you can get away with having just a 10-line Lambda function instead of a 5-line Lambda function, but there's 200 lines of code describing an object hierarchy using object-oriented principles for a Lambda function that's only going to be executed a few times, and that hugely expansive abstraction you built is never going to be used again, that might have been a little overcomplicated. So what serverless can do for you really nicely, especially on the coding side, is help you actually reduce the amount of code you need to write. And what's really useful is when you're building stuff by consuming these managed services in the cloud for you, you can replace a lot of the stuff you would normally do in code with these managed services. So instead of importing a library to have a message queue system that you need to now manage in code, you can use a service in AWS like SQS to do that. Or if you need to produce some kind of pub subsystem, instead of building your own and importing a library to help you with that, just use SNS. There's so many examples of this where you could rather use the existing managed services in the cloud just to keep everything much simpler for you so you have less to worry about. And this might sound contradictory. If you're an engineer, you're thinking code is awesome. I should be writing more code, right? Well, believe it or not, code is where all the bugs are. So if you write more code, you've got a much greater chance of introducing bugs. So if you use something that's been used and proved by thousands of other people instead of just you, it's less likely to have bugs in it. So it usually ends up being a stronger, better solution in the long term.
I was gonna say, I love finding tools that help me code less. Just makes life
Yeah.
so much simpler. um, what are your thoughts on local development? I know we talked a little bit previously about this.
Yeah, and local development in serverless specifically is kind of tricky. Traditionally, if you've been in the engineering field for a while, if you're just starting out, you're probably going to join an organization, and your first day or two is going to end up sitting around with somebody else on the team helping set up the local development environment on your work laptop so that you can write code on your machine, execute it on your machine, test it on your machine, check it into the Git repo, and that's your work done because you've done it all on your machine and it seems to work great. The problem with that is that your machine is not the production machine where your users actually are. So often, sometimes more often than you would like, the code that really worked great on your own machine ends up being pushed into a production environment and kind of doesn't work the way it's supposed to. There's some bugs there because you couldn't exactly replicate the production environment on your local machine. It's kind of tough, especially if your production environment ends up being 20 virtual machines and big, massive databases that are replicated with load balancers and caches and all the other technologies that are used in production environments to keep them up and running. Gets kind of tricky to replicate that. But we've had to do that. That's kind of been a necessity, in the past, because it's very expensive to replicate those kinds of production environments on a local machine. It's a really tough thing to do, costs a lot of money, and you wouldn't actually want to do that. So kind of stuck in a hard place where you try to get the best possible local solution to test with before it goes into production. And then, you kind of, work out the differences between that and so on. In the serverless world, it's even trickier though, because you've got these fully managed cloud services that you now can't use. You can't really build locally. So that becomes a really tough one. Now, you cannot emulate your production environment locally very accurately at all, because it's not just a machine running code. It's now a managed service that AWS provides, like Lambda or DynamoDB or API Gateway. So now local development is tough to do in this case, because your best bet then is to rather test in the cloud directly instead of trying to emulate everything locally. So that becomes a little tougher to do in the serverless world, which is where a lot of the development tools that we are seeing coming out now, including those from Serverless Inc., are to help developers build things locally. If you are tied into the serverless framework news, you might have noticed we have a small little beta test going on right now with a tool called Compose to help you deploy applications a little bit quicker. We have various tools to help you read logs from the cloud quicker. All these kinds of tools to help you test and develop in the cloud directly instead of locally, because of this difficulty of managing, production stuff on your local machine in the serverless world.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the different types of projects that you could build? They could be like fun projects or just like educational projects that can help our audience understand things that they could be building as well.
Well, you obviously get the usual. There's the really common to-do list. That's probably the easiest one to do, because there's a very little bit of front end on that, but there's a lot of some interesting back-end API stuff that you can do. There's a whole bunch of examples out there if you look for serverless to do that you'll find. Very easy to get. There's also some really interesting stuff, and I don't even need to talk about toys, because building serverless stuff just in your day job is actually kind of awesome. So some of the stuff that I've ended up having to build out of necessity, some things that you might not realize that you can actually do, which is pretty awesome, is things like image management. And imagine if you've got images that you want to use in your web application, but your clients can differ. So you might have iPhones and tablets, browsers, and so on. And you'd like to use the same images, but different aspect ratios, different sizes, different formats. They need to be lighter for mobile devices than they need to be for desktop. And one of the ways you could do that is you could set this all up through CSS and so on, which is great, but you still need to manage those actual images. They still need to be made available. And one way to do that, using serverless, you can actually dynamically create images. So where this is useful is an e-commerce application that I used to work on as a day job. And one of the first serverless things we did there was image manipulation, where the photography team could upload their enormous multi-megabyte sized image files. And we had a way to dynamically, at the moment that somebody requested that product for the first time, they were on desktop, the image was automatically scaled for the desktop, stored on S3, which is a place to store files in AWS, and then sent to the person's browser. And then every person with a browser after that got that image. And then somebody came with a mobile device, somebody came with another device with a different aspect ratio. It was absolutely awesome to see these images automatically generated over time as folks started viewing photographs taken by the team. And this took over a task that the photography team would have to then spend most of their afternoons trying to convert images, format them correctly, come to the dev team. Is this the right format? Is this too big? Is this too small? There's laborious processes that you can now build stuff with serverless to do. Some other interesting things that I've worked on is review systems. Working for a travel company where there were embedded reviews from customers on specific travel products that the company provided. And these normally have to be done through third-party systems to keep them authentic for Google rankings and so on. And that was ultimately ended up being built through serverless, where we were able to sort of dynamically load these elements into a page based on a whole API that was sitting in the back from this third-party engine. Machine learning is a really big one that happens in the serverless world these days. So you can actually, and recently AWS announced a massive increase in files in disk sizes with AWS Lambda. So if you're using these big libraries for machine learning stuff, you can totally do that in Lambda as well these days.
Awesome. If you had to summarize how someone could start building all of these really cool projects in like a minute, or like what's your quickest summary of just how to get started with building these projects?
Really, it's getting into. It's just a matter of playing. One of the things that I found really useful getting started with the serverless framework was getting into the documentation. It sounds really boring and really dry, like the documentation. Are you serious? But the serverless framework has amazing documentation where I ended up looking at the reference for the serverless.yaml file, because one of the cool things you've got is that Lambda functions can be triggered by bunches of things inside AWS or other cloud providers. So the traditional one that you'll see in most getting started guides is the HTTP event. So if you looked at the configuration file for a serverless framework project, a function can be triggered by an event. An HTTP event makes API gateway, but you could have things like S3 events. So you could have a system where if somebody uploads something into AWS, it triggers a Lambda function, and you could run code on this file that was uploaded. Or you could have IoT devices. The IoT service of AWS can connect to Lambda functions. So you could have Lambda functions triggering when an IoT device sends a message into the cloud. So you can play around with your IoT stuff. You could have databases. DynamoDB is a really amazing database inside AWS, really good at high volume stuff. And it can hook into Lambda as well. So if you put data into a database table, it can do stuff automatically for you in Lambda functions. So just looking through things like the configuration file reference for the serverless.yaml file in the serverless framework can just clue you into all these potential possibilities. You're looking at your specific problem you need to solve for your organization, and you can remember, oh yeah, I saw this thing in that documentation for the serverless framework. I know it can do that. That's awesome. We can just solve this problem right now in minutes. It really is as easy as just adding these events on, running a deploy command, and they're up and running, and you can play with them and try them out. It's awesome.
Beautiful. I love how easy and simple that is. I've actually checked out your documentation. It's very well written and easy to follow. So hopefully if students have any questions, they can always reach out to you, and I'll link your socials down below as well.
Awesome.
This is our final sort of episode on serverless and all things serverless. And I was stalking your LinkedIn, and I saw this little quote that you had in there that said, serverless web application development has shown its true potential as the future of web development. So what are your thoughts on just like the future of serverless or the future of web dev?
Yeah, serverless is at its beginning stages. It's really only getting started going right now. And to me, it feels like it's been forever. But I have to keep reminding myself that I'm in this world. I'm sunk deep in. I'm surrounded by it all the time. But many folks aren't. And often when I end up speaking about serverless stuff, the biggest question I get is, what is serverless? So it's really great that we can talk about this stuff and just let people know what this is. Ultimately, for me, the idea of serverless being the future is that this is just the natural progression of where we've been going all this time. And if you try and look back at where we've come from and how things are progressing, it just indicates that this is the direction things are going. And serverless is not the end of the road. This isn't the be all and end all. Serverless is where it is at now, and it's evolving and moving forward. But we've gone from you needing to have your own machine sitting in your own rack, in your own room, in your office somewhere with air conditioning and internet to provide these services to your customers, moving that to someone else's data center, then moving the entire machine away and using someone else's machine, to now not even knowing what the machine is or caring about the actual machine. You're just using a service that gives you an internet connection that somebody can then speak to your code with. And I think it's only going to continue from there. And this also comes right the way back to the shortage of talent that we started right at the beginning with, where if the industry is so tight on people being around to solve problems, we need to find a way to fill that gap, and not requiring everybody to build everything from scratch. Building abstractions on top of abstractions is where we need to go in order to accelerate and continue to provide these solutions. And serverless is just going to keep going, and something's ultimately going to come along that replaces it. But it's yeah, I don't know what that is going to look like right now, but
That's awesome. Well, I'm really excited to get my hands dirty with serverless. Hopefully next week we'll get a chance to build some projects with it as well. But thank you so much, Gareth, for joining us today. It was really lovely to get a chance to just learn about all these new technologies that I didn't even know existed. I've been working with serverless for a year, and I had no idea that you could, improve your own serverless building process with something like this. So thank you so much.
absolutely, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.